to me, my X-Men.
If you're anything like me, you were besotted with the OG X-Men cartoon from the 90s, and the remake, X-Men 97, has reawakened the childlike, wide-eyed nerd inside me, and I thought it was high time to get some mutant heroes on the channel. And where better to start than Professor Charles Xavier himself. Hi guys, my name is Mithril, and welcome to my How to Paint Professor X painting tutorial. So of course I'm going to be keeping my Professor X as close to the original cartoon depiction as I possibly can. This means green jacket, crisp white shirt, and the iconic yellow hoverchair. Wheelchair? Hoverchair. There is a distinct clash of styles here, as I'm going to be using a lot of softer hues and highlights for the Professor himself, and deviating onto a lot of harsh, crisp edge highlights for the panelling and straight lines of the chair. I'll be working my Xavier off of a grey undercoat once assembled, and using the Citadel Mechanica Standard Grey to get this on. The X-Men need their figurehead to get ready to fight, so that's enough jabbering from me. Brushes ready guys, and let's get painting. I'm starting off by base coating Professor X's head and hands with basic flesh. You can see this looks really patchy at the moment. This is because I'm going to apply this in a few thin down coats to get a nice smooth finish over his bald head and skin. Next I'm carefully picking out the collar, shirt and the little cuffs that poke out the bottom of his jacket sleeve using rainy grey. I'm carefully picking out his tie now using Cantabaric blue. However, this can wait until you finish with the shirt, which is probably the smarter way to go about this. I'm painting up my Professor X to be more like his 90s cartoon counterpart, rather than the white jacketed version on the box art, which just makes my inner child so happy. To this end, I'm applying a base coat to the Professor's suit jacket now, using Ardennes green. Again, wanting to make sure I have a smooth, solid finish when this is completely dried. The blanket that sits on Professor X's lap, I'm giving a base coat now using red leather. His hoverchair I'm now basing with a solid coat of Arabic shadow. Now yellowy hues like this are notorious for their lack of effective coverage, but by keeping my brushstrokes long and unbroken and again applying a few thin down layers, I should end up with a rich, solid, flat coat of yellow to build off later on. Now I'm brushing a shade onto Xavier's skin using slightly diluted pink flesh. This would be more natural than a manual shade given the varying textures across his head and facial details in particular. Building up the reflective surface of Xavier's head is going to be a challenge alongside picking out his sharper, more defined facial features. I'm applying a post-shade layer to all his skin using harvester flesh. As you can see, I'm keeping this solid and unbroken across his scalp and back of the head, and trying to leave the pink flesh shade showing down the side of his temples, around the facial recesses and between all the fingers. I'm building up the initial highlights now with a 1-to-1 mix of harvester flesh and pale skin. Here I'm looking to define Xavier's facial features and hand definition more, whilst defining the outer shape of his head, concentrating on drawing this up from his temples and over across the back of his neck. I'm using lighter tones here to make these features more prominent earlier on. Building this up to an extreme edge highlight using pure pale skin. With this, I'm focusing on the nose, brow, chin, knuckles and fingertips. I'm not drawing this highlight the entire way over his scalp as I want to reinforce the shading and directional light hitting the Professor from the front, so I'm just simply defining the temples and the forehead a bit in particular here. Finally, I'm picking up the eyes with my usual method, using black to paint in the eye recesses and 2 dots of nacre either side to finish off the pupils. I'm applying a quick manual shade to the shirt using brown grey. Working from the inner to the outer of this model will really streamline the whole process for me here. Before the final highlights, I'm just applying a quick layer with a 1-to-1 mix of graphite and white, just reinforcing the framed edges of the collar and cuffs and bringing up the tone of his chest pressing against the shirt. A final extreme edge highlight is now applied to the shirt, using pure white, just to make it pop in amongst the greens and blue of the jacket and tie. A layer is then applied to the tie using Caspian blue. Followed by an extreme edge highlight down the length of the tie using Bering blue. And finally picking out the teeny tiny tie clip using thrash metal. Right, now Charles is mostly suited and booted, he's got his posh togs on, it's time to tackle his suit jacket using those characteristic green tones from the OG 90s cartoon. I'm going to start by applying a recessed shade to the material folds now with a rough 2-to-1 ratio mix of Ardennes green and Black Forest green. If you want these recesses to be darker, then by all means experiment with the concentration of Black Forest in the mix. I'm tying the manual shade together and reinforcing the shading a little more now with an all-over shade with diluted croak green. Now it's time to start building up some lovely texture over Professor's suit jacket. I'm going to be starting with a 2-to-1 ratio mix of Ardennes green and Sherwood green, layering this over the upper folds and material surfaces that be more prominent against the light, leaving the shading in the recesses as much as possible. Now, given the pose and lack of movement within Professor's jacket, there aren't a lot of hugely well-defined folds in the material itself. However, the style and sculpt of the model lends itself to easy placement for this layering stage. Through multiple layers, I'm building up the tone of the green jacket to a layer stage using pure Sherwood green, starting to focus more and more on the edges and more prominent fold and material. As you can see, the jacket is taking on a slightly velvety, crushed suede look, which is exactly what I want for my Professor Xavier. Swanky! For the final stage, I'm using a 2-to-1 mix of Sherwood green and fall green, and I'm just applying this as an extreme edge highlight to the upper folds, most pronounced edging, and areas of particular focus include his shoulders, creases in the material where it bunches as he's sitting, the lapels, and framing the skeletal structure of the jacket itself. By this I mean focusing on the seams where the stitching will be holding it together and other areas that are prominent like this. Only a little bit of material left, then it's on to the dreaded, not at all difficult to paint because it's yellow, Hoverchair. In contrast to the shape and style of the jacket, the blanket that sits across Professor X's legs has a lot of very well defined folds and breaks up a lot of the harsher edges brought to the model from the angular shape of the wheelchair itself. To begin painting the blanket, I'm starting with a manual shade being applied to the recessed folds using Arbuckle's Brown, making sure I work this alongside the armrests and in the front panelling too. As with the jacket, I'm now building up the texture over the blanket, this time using a 1-to-1 mix of red leather and blood red, really starting to define the crumpled, ruffled look of the material covering the Professor's legs. I'm going to start building up the tones of the blanket by adding small amounts of pink flesh into the previous mix. This will lighten the hue of the red softly and minimise the risk of me oversaturating them against green and yellows. You can add more pink flesh as you progress. I'm finishing at a mix that was roughly 3 parts pink flesh to 1 part layer mix before the final highlight. Now you can see I have a lovely rich burgundy colour for Professor X's blanket. I'm now just going to accentuate the highest raised points and curves using pure pink flesh. Having built up my layers previously with the small additions of this into the layer mix, this shouldn't come as too stark a tone to finish off the cloth. Great, now that's Professor X done himself, now it's time to move on to the bit I definitely haven't been putting off for the entirety of this video up to this point. Now to maintain a consistent finish to the shading of the chair, I'm going to be washing rather than manual shading. I'm working with a mix which is 3 parts Gobi Brown and 1 part Indian Shadow, diluted with water, and applying this as an all-over shade to the body of the wheelchair. Working this into the edges and grooves of all the panelling and cabling where most of the shade is going to be situated. I'm now working on blocking out all the panelling again using a 1-to-1 mix of Arabic Shadow and Iroko. As you can see here, I'm leaving the shade showing in the gaps between the panelling and the grooves between all the metals. A larger brush will work for the larger panelling, but for the more intricate cabling, you can use the edge of your brush to avoid this layer bleeding into your shaded areas. Now the layering and highlight stages to the chair are going to be a much more different to the softer application of paint we've used for the jacket and the blanket respectively at this point. I want these to be very sharp, very angular, and as straight as my poor little brush will allow. I'm starting by applying a reasonably thick edge to all the panelling and edges using Iroko. Now the key here is consistency. I want my lining to be as smooth as possible and stay the same width across all these areas. This will be time consuming, but this is probably the most time consuming part. The following highlights will be much easier with this in place as a guideline. I'm going around the edges of the chair once again, this time using high key yellow, which will really start bringing up the vibrancy of the highlights. As you can see, I'm trying to keep my lines thinner and thinner with every pass. This way I get a smooth transition from the thicker layer lines through to the sharpest edges with the lighter yellows, trying to use the edge of my brush for as much control wherever possible. You can start adding white into this if you want this to be a little brighter and sharper at this stage as well. When you're happy with how the framework and highlights over the chair are looking, you can apply just a quick dot highlight using white sands to the corners, angles and sharpest points of the chair, just to give it a little bit more of a glint in the light. Any metallic details, controls, grates and wiring I'm now very carefully just picking out using heavy metal. I'm quickly giving these a targeted shade using Nuln Oil. Finally, giving these a quick edge highlight using speed metal, just to frame them against the bulk of the yellows. The padding of the chair I'm now carefully picking out against the Professor using black leather, trying my best to avoid clipping any of the yellows or Xavier's finished jacket. The segments of the seat cushion I'm now picking out individually with a rough mix of 2 parts black leather and 1 part basic flesh. You can add more basic flesh and apply an edge highlight to the cushion if you feel it's necessary here as well. The plume underneath the chair is finally getting a base coat of brown-grey. A dry brush is now being applied to pick out the texture of the plume, going against the grain of the sculpt for the best possible coverage. And finally, a lighter dry brush using my heavy white is applied in the same way. Just because someone stumbles and loses their path doesn't mean they're lost forever. Sometimes we all need a little help, and hopefully I've been able to provide that to you today with my take on the figurehead of mutant kind, the one and only Professor Charles Xavier, leader of the X-Men and avid advocate for mutant rights, ready to hit the tabletop. I really hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Please remember to like, subscribe and hit that bell for video notifications. Thank you so much for all our Patreons so far. Your support is amazing. Thank you so much. If you want to continue to support the channel in another way, please head over to our Patreon page. The link is in the description below over at patreon.com/planetmithril if that's something you are interested in doing. Absolutely no pressure, as always. But I really hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Take care, guys, and as always, happy hobbying. Bye, guys.